I want to ask the question that I think is on everyone's mind here today, as we have seen over the weekend the implementation day with the agreement with Iran, the fact that the sanctions that have been put in place on oil coming out of Iran have now been lifted, that those reserves that were sitting in tankers offshore are now able to go out and find customers. You have suggested, Mr. Szymanski, that in 16 we should anticipate about 300,000 barrels coming out of Iran into the global oil market. By 17, 500,000 additional.
Additional, right.
That's what I'd like to ask you about, because there's been suggestions that that what we will see ultimately from Iran is in the range of a million barrels a day coming from Iran. When you look to the longer term and what is happening with the response today from Iran getting their oil out on the market, the impact to the global market and to the price of oil, the fact that we already have a glut of oil out on the market, what does that mean for the short-term pricing of oil? You've indicated your estimate is somewhere between 40 and 50 between year 2016 and 2017. Can you give me more certainty going beyond 17 in terms of what Iran does to the market? And then also, if you can discuss, and I'll ask you, Mr. Haft, to join this conversation, discuss the situation in Venezuela and the fact that you have indicated that we can't ignore Venezuela in this discussion as we're looking at the international picture on production. So if we can have this conversation, Iran, Venezuela, and just for good measure, we can throw in Saudi Arabia here. Mr. Szymanski, if you want to start.
Senator, Iran had been producing about 2.8 million barrels a day of crude oil and other liquids. So we think that could hit 3.3 million barrels a day by the end of 2016. So there's, these numbers move around. A lot depends on how much comes out of storage and how much comes out of production. And I'll come back to that in a second. And then we thought that the number could hit 3.7 million barrels a day by the end of 2017. So that's a little less than a million, but it's close to that million barrel a day growth number from where they are now to where they would be at the end of 2017. The annual averages would be a little bit different because the trend is up, so the annual averages are going to be a little bit lower. In thinking about Iran, there are two aspects to this. They have between 30 and 50 million barrels of floating storage in tankers that could come onto the market fairly quickly, but a lot of that is believed to be condensate, so it's a very light kind of crude oil, and the markets for that are mostly in chemicals business, and a lot of it was probably destined for China, and we'll just have to see how that works into the estimates for China's economic growth. The second aspect is how quickly production can actually grow, and that may depend on how rapidly foreign investment is allowed to come into Iran to help them rebuild their oil fields. And that could be a bit slow too, so there are a lot of uncertainties in this. And then layering on something that Antoine mentioned earlier, this relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Iran is very important. Iran is one of the three big players, along with those other two countries, in the Gulf area, and how each of those countries puts their volumes of crude oil on the market has a lot to do with where prices end up, and so there's probably going to be a lot of back and forth between those three countries. So I think we're back to that observation that says that the uncertainty in crude oil prices as we look out over the next year or two is very high.
Greater volatility. Mr. Hoff?
Yes, I agree totally. I think for Iran, the question is, there's four questions that we have to consider. The first one is, how much can they produce now? The second one is, how much are they willing to produce now? The third is, how much is the market capable of absorbing now from Iran? And the fourth is, how much is the long-term production capacity, or the capacity to increase production in the longer term? The bottom line is nobody knows exactly how much they can produce today. We tried to look at it when I was working at the International Energy Agency, looking at testimony from people who've had access to the fields there. Our perception was that Iran had managed to repair some of the damage that had been caused under the previous president, Ahmadinejad, and that it had the capacity to increase production fairly rapidly, almost instantly, by somewhere between 500 and 800,000 barrels per day. The question is for Iran, how much is it willing to sell given its price appetite? It's always been a hawkish member of OPEC. Since the early days of the Iranian Revolution, it's always taken the view that the West or the market should pay more for oil, and that oil is worth more than the market is paying for it. So, not surprisingly, I think Iranian leaders have made contradictory statements over the last few months. They've said they wanted to ramp up production immediately, but they've also said they don't want to crash the market, they don't want to flood the market too quickly with too much oil and cause the price to fall even further. So the real question is how much the market can take. And I don't think it can take more than a few 100,000, initially 2, 3, maybe 400, and it's going to be a gradual ramp up for Iran to regain its market share. Now, the capacity to increase production over the longer term, that will depend on the willingness of investors to go back, the terms offered, and that's much more questionable, much more longer term. You had asked about...
Yeah, go ahead, because I asked about Venezuela. We haven't heard that yet.
Venezuela is struggling. Its production capacity has been degrading over the years. Production volumes have been falling. It's managed to produce as much as it can, but its revenue has been doubly hit by the drop in volumes and the drop in prices, and it can't sustain its production. Now, PDVSA, the national oil company, is asking for its foreign partners to pay for the light liquids or the condensates or the naphtha that they import to blend their heavy crude to export it. The partners are not willing to do that. It's going downhill, and the social outlook, the social stability outlook, is also looking very bleak. Now, the question there is whether social turmoil could actually cause production to fall or to be disrupted, as had been the case in 2002, 2003, during the general strike there. And my view is that capacity is probably more insulated now from social turmoil than it had been at the time, but the outlook and the capacity to sustain production looks very, very dismal.
Thank you for your comments. Yeah, this whole discussion about Iran is just so galling as a representative from a state that has enormous potential. We will, as a country, tell Iran, go ahead, produce more. Well, at the same time, we're going to continue locking up our potential for further oil exploration and production, whether it's on Anwar or whether it is their potential for offshore. So know that this is going to be a year where you're going to continue to hear me not complaining, but being very discouraged and very, really quite angry at the way that we have chosen to advance a policy when it comes to greater reliance on people, nations that have not been good actors, and yet continuing sanctions on ourselves, which is what we're doing with certainly Alaska production. Senator Cantwell.